guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Ashley, and if you're new here, this is Heebee Jeebeez TV, and I like to talk about crime, creepy, and unbelievable stories. Now, since you guys really did like my last video on top 5 stories, we're going to continue this series, and every time I upload one of these videos, the topic will change. It depends on what I find interesting at the time, or if you guys have any suggestions, just leave them in the comments below. Quick reminder though, please comment, like, subscribe if you guys enjoy my content. It really does help me grow here on YouTube, and if you guys want more crime creepy content, check out my TikTok. I will link it in the description box below. Alright, so enough rambling, let's get into today's video. Now, if you can see the title, then you know we're going to talk about 5 very strange, creepy, wartime stories that have to do with ghostly encounters and, of course, cryptids. So the more and more I dig deeper into the paranormal, the more I get into history. And when you think about it, you really cannot have one without the other. You can't have creepy ghost stories with knowing the story behind of what caused the situation to be what it is. What was the reason for all of this to even begin in the first place? So I took a look at history and thought about where I could find some more interesting stories to share with you guys. And of course, war came to mind. With the amount of countless lives lost, both in forces and civilians, you're bound to come across haunted battlefields, homes, ghostly encounters, and strange sightings. So let's talk about 5 of the creepiest ghostly wartime and cryptid encounters that I have come across. Alright, so number 5 is going to be about army tunnel rats. This story takes us to the Vietnam War, which was one of the deadliest wars that lasted about 20 years between 1955 to 1975 in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. This story actually comes from a terminally ill Vietnam veteran who we will call Jack. And for reference, these are not actual tunnel rats. There is an explanation. So these were actually soldiers whose job was to quite literally crawl through the Vietnamese underground tunnels and eradicate any hiding soldiers from below, or even those who sought refuge underground. It was one of the most dangerous jobs you could have during the war because the tunnels were long, dark, and often filled with very dangerous and deadly traps. On one particular mission, Jack and his troops were making their way through one of these tunnels. As they were making their way deeper and deeper into the tunnel, they were overcome by a very strong, disgusting smell. All they could really do was think about what the smell reminded them of, and the only thing they could compare it to was decaying flesh, which unfortunately is a smell that they had gotten used to being in war at the time. As they reached the end of the tunnel, they came to a much larger room underground. They discovered a small oil-lit lamp which lit the room enough for them to see a large tarp covering one of the walls at the end. Curious though, the men approached and lifted the tarp, and to their surprise, it was another long dark tunnel with a descending staircase. So of course, curious, they followed the path slowly and cautiously until they reached the very end, and that's when they came face to face with another tarp. Expecting to lift it up and see another tunnel, the men carefully removed the tarp, only to discover a scene that they could hardly explain and just didn't make a lot of sense. So to their surprise, they see 3 women and 7 men who appear to be Vietnamese hiding and slowly rocking back and forth in the same position, almost as if they were kind of like in the fetal position, just rocking back and forth, traumatized or afraid of something. All of them appear to be heavily shell-shocked with a blank expression across their faces, and none of them even bothered to glance over at the soldiers when they walked into the room. One thing though that was said to have terrified the soldiers was that all of these people had odd-looking eyes. They had turned into one single color of being completely black. As the soldiers scanned the room, they looked to the corner and noticed a strange looking statue that all the people were staring at. It was a golden statue of a beautiful woman, except the lower half of the body was tentacles. This was something none of the soldiers had ever seen. They had no idea what this thing could have been. So, not knowing what to make of this entire situation, they simply reverted back to their one and only mission to basically destroy the enemy. Jack and his soldiers then went about rigging the entire cave with C4 and quickly left. But as they were exiting the tunnel, one of them heard a very faint whisper that was calling all of them back. Needless to say, all of the men got out of there as quickly as they could and didn't talk about the story for a very long time, and to this day have absolutely no idea what that statue was or what to make of the entire situation. Our next story is about the Vietnam rock apes. Now, going back to Vietnam, this story precedes the Great War, but gained a lot of attention thanks to many American troops that came back with very strange stories and sightings to tell about these creatures. Of course, we all know that Vietnam is not a stranger to primates, so soldiers were used to seeing these and all sorts of creatures that as they maneuvered themselves throughout the dense jungles. However, there was one particular area that came known to be as Monkey Mountain, because of the number of strange sightings that actually occurred on this peak. Troops went on to grow extremely fearful of the area because they would constantly be attacked by human-like creatures that had 5-inch fangs, were able to climb steep mountains and rocks. They were also said to have red hair and ape-like features, including extra long limbs. Some soldiers even say that these creatures were carrying young offspring with them. But where does the name rock ape come from? Well, it wasn't necessarily based on the environment exactly as you might think. It was because these creatures would quite literally throw very heavy rocks at the soldiers. Quite surprisingly, whatever these creatures were had absolutely no fear of humans. They had absolutely no problem confronting soldiers, which is why so many of them had these strange stories and experiences. So that makes us question what these things could have really been. Of course, taking a skeptic or a scientific approach, logic would tell you that these are simply some sort of primate living in the jungle. It would only make sense. Could it have been a gorilla? Well, most soldiers at the time thought that these things were orangutans, which would make sense if you look at their description of what they saw. They do sound to be similar to an orangutan. That's because of their red-orangey fur color, along with their long limbs and protruding bellies. But the problem is that orangutans don't live in Vietnam. They are only found in Borneo and Sumatra, which is quite a long swim from Vietnam. And these stories of these strange rock apes actually became so rampant during the war that in 1974, the general of Vietnam's People's Army ordered an expedition to capture and research these creatures. However, they were never able to capture one or do any further studies. However, if you ask the locals, they will tell you stories of a creature called the Ngoi Rong, which translates to forest people that live deep in the jungles of Vietnam and have no fear of man. Unfortunately, due to the lack of evidence, skeptics and scholars have chalked these sightings up to hallucinations from the soldiers that were either using illegal substances or suffering from extreme heat and stress. But let me know what you guys think. Our next story takes us to America and the Battle of the Alamos that actually took place in 1836. This was a very mighty fight between Texans and Mexicans as Texas was seeking their independence. It was quite a disastrous battle for the Texans. They managed to lose all of their troops, and after the battle was fought, the bodies of those who lost their lives were gathered and then burned in a mass grave. It was shortly after that incident that people started reporting ghostly sightings and coming forward with very strange stories. Mexican General Santa Anna had ordered his troops to burn down the Church of the Alamo because he didn't want any Texans using this as a shrine or as a reminder of the day that Texans rebelled against Mexico. Doing as they were told, of course, his soldiers went back to the Alamo and began planning. However, when they arrived, they literally turned right back around and headed back to the Mexican campsite. When they returned back to the Mexican campsite, it was very clear that something terrible had happened. All of the soldiers were said to have been shaking. Some appeared to be ghostly white and could barely talk. When one of them finally gathered himself enough to explain what had happened, he had a very terrifying story to tell. When they reached the Alamo Church, they were greeted by 6 demonic-looking creatures that were guarding the church, all with flaming swords in their hands. The men, terrified, horrified about what they were looking at, they didn't bother to stay any longer than they needed to be there out of fear, because they just had absolutely no idea what was going to happen if they tried to burn down the church. Immediately, all the men at the Mexican campsite began speculating and figured that these demons must have been the souls of the Texan soldiers who refused to let go of the Alamo. The general, of course, laughed at this. He thought that they were being completely ridiculous, so he said that he was going to go do it himself. However, when he arrived, he was greeted with a huge surprise. Immediately, from the roof of the church, something manifested. It was a very tall, dark, shadowy spirit with a ball of fire in each hand. As you can imagine, the general and his troops were horrified, completely caught off guard by whatever this was, and they were said to have ran off and never returned to the site. The church then went abandoned for years and years and almost risked being demolished several times. It wasn't until the 1890s when it became a police headquarters and also a jail, but the ghost sightings remained and even grew. Reports would come in constantly of ghostly apparitions, especially of soldiers walking throughout the area. There were dark figures roaming the hallways, strange moans coming from the darkness. The activity was said to have gotten so bad that patrol officers would refuse to work the night shift because they were just so terrified of what they would see, hear, or even feel at times. And it got so bad that the jail was eventually forced to close down and move locations. In 1905, the Alamo then became a museum with ghostly encounters in tow. Visitors claim to feel extremely uneasy as they make their way through the halls. Some are said to be overcome with fear and despair and burst into tears. Others say they hear disembodied voices and phantom footsteps. But whatever seems to be haunting the Alamo seems to want to stay. Our next story takes us to Afghanistan, and this story, I have to say, really gave me the chills and just makes me wonder what is really out there. So this story is known as Observation Point Rock. Now, this location has been deemed to be extremely haunted by not only US Marines, but by British soldiers as well. It's located in a very rural area of Afghanistan, a few hundred meters away from the patrol base Hassan Abad. So this story takes us back to 2009 when a group of American Marines were set to take over the post from a group of British soldiers. When they arrived, they were very surprised to see that the soldiers were in quite a distressed sort of condition. They were kinda itching to get out of there. They really didn't go over all of the normal protocols that would normally be the case when switching over stations. All the American soldiers were told was that the area was believed to be extremely haunted, that there were strange lights in the sky, and that there was even a mass grave below the observation point that was a result from the failed Soviet invasion back in the 80s. One of the British soldiers even warned them that if they were to accidentally dig anything up, they were to bury it back. And he didn't elaborate on this. He just kind of gave it as an order, which kind of creeped out the American troops because they had absolutely no idea what this eerie message could have meant. So the American troops were set to be there for 60 days. And one evening, one of the soldiers was on guard duty overnight while the rest of the troops were sleeping. It was a quiet night when suddenly his radio started making an odd noise. And initially, he kind of just ignored it and kept watch looking out into the distance. Then the crackling on the radio started up again, and this time he starts hearing odd voices speaking in a language that he didn't fully understand. He keeps listening and trying to make out what's being said, and he knows that it's not English. And eventually, after a few minutes, he was able to make out that the voices were speaking in Russian, which made absolutely no sense to him. No one speaking Russian should have had access to that particular radio line. So he calls his main base and asks them if anyone's doing anything with the radio or if the radio line has somehow been intercepted. But they all tell him no. The strange noises just continued all night up until the next morning. And that's when he told the soldier that was taking over his role that day to take watch. He told him that the radios were being weird and that he should probably grab a new one. As the new soldier had taken over the new position, he kept watch. And early on into his shift, he noticed that there was a trench surrounding the observation rock, but there was something odd about it. The trench was not very deep. Anyone who would be standing in that particular trench wouldn't really be able to take cover and would generally be exposed to the enemy. It just didn't make a sense because the purpose of the trench was for soldiers to take cover in case there was any firings. So he alerts the rest of his troops, and they all agree that their goal during their 60-day stay would be to dig a proper trench. So on they went, they start digging, and just after a few digs, they hit something metallic. It was a metal object, and it had some writing on it that appeared to be Russian. This didn't really throw them off because they were aware that this area was used by the Soviet Union from the invasion in the 80s, so it wasn't anything super unusual for them to discover. So they keep digging, and they come across more unusual objects. Some appear to be pottery, plates, but then suddenly they hit something different. It appeared to be a bone. They take a look at it and they quickly realize that this is a human bone. And they were quite surprised at how shallow this grave was. So they put the bone back and moved to a different part of the trench because they didn't really want to disrupt someone that was resting there. So they go over to a different area and they start digging. However, to their surprise, as they were digging, more and more bones became exposed. So this is when they quickly realized this is what the British soldiers must have meant to put things back in case they accidentally dug anything up. Several nights later, one of the soldiers was on guard duty when he was overcome with this horrendous feeling like he was just being watched. And I'm pretty sure most of us have experienced this very creepy feeling when we're alone. Usually at night, you just have this very odd feeling that sometimes you're not alone. He turns in all directions, tries to see if there's anyone with him, but he doesn't see anyone. Then when he least expected it, he hears this horrifying scream coming from right behind him. He turns around, he's using his night vision goggles, and he sees a man running from bush to bush in the distance. The other Marines all heard the scream too because it was so loud that it woke up everyone. And at this point, everyone was just on guard looking, trying to find where the scream came from and where the man that was running from bush to bush had gone. They found absolutely nothing, and all of them just stayed awake the rest of the night on duty. On day 26, it had been a very hot day. They were very sweaty. It was very hot, so uncomfortable. But then suddenly the temperature ended up dropping inside of their base. The soldiers thought it must have been an incoming storm, but then they were overcome by this very odd feeling. They just felt like something bad was going to happen. And then they started hearing whispers coming from inside the room. The soldier then hears footsteps coming from up above him. So he jumps out and expects to see one of the other soldiers walking around on the roof. But when he looks, there's absolutely no one there, and the other Marines were actually sleeping. He tries to brush this off and goes back to guarding and observing to see if there were any intruders nearby, but to his surprise, he ends up seeing a man far off in the distance. He was very spooked by this initially, and he thought he might have been seeing things, so he takes a second look, and this time he doesn't see anything. He wasn't exactly sure what to make of this situation. He thought that his mind must have been playing tricks on him. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe it was the heat. So he brushed it off and he didn't see anyone again for the rest of the night. The following day, though, he was so bothered by his experience the night before that he really did feel like he was losing his mind, and he put in a request to be transferred to a different base. And surprisingly, it was granted, and this was said to have made the rest of the soldiers on his team extremely upset because they all felt like he was copping out and taking the easy way out. Several days later, one of the other soldiers was on the observation deck when he sees what he thought was a Taliban member. However, when he looks again using his thermal lens, the person was gone. He stops and then switches to his night vision, and this time the man was much, much closer to him. He stops, he switches to his thermal vision again, and this time the man is gone. He just could not understand or explain why he was able to see the man with one goggle and not with the other. It just did not make any sense. Suddenly, he feels a tap on the back of his shoulder, and to his horror, as he turns around expecting to see another soldier, he sees nothing. Over the next 10 days, the same thing would happen to the rest of the members on the team, which ended up making them all talk to each other about it and basically scaring themselves throughout the rest of their stay. On the day before they were set to leave on day 59, all of the radios suddenly died without explanation. However, since they were just one night away from finally being transferred out of there, they figured that they could just deal with it. Nothing would happen on their final night. Later that evening, when the entire crew was sleeping and least expected it, gunfire broke out, and absolutely no one could figure out where all of these shots were coming from. It just kept getting louder and louder, and they could hear bigger weapons being used, the different types of weapons that soldiers use, and they were able to recognize them just by sound. However, they had absolutely no idea where all of this was coming from or even who was doing it, but they all suspected that it must have been the Taliban. And just as quickly as all this commotion began, it just stopped and there was complete silence. They all sat there in hiding, kind of just waiting for the firing to restart. They didn't think that it would just kind of stop suddenly, but it never did. It never started back up again. They hid there until sunrise, and once they figured that it was safe enough to stand up and walk around, they started inspecting the entire base to see what kind of damage they were looking at. However, they were not ready for what they would see. In what could only be explained as a horror plot movie twist, the men saw absolutely no damage or evidence that there was any sort of intense gunfire the night before. Not a single bullet hole was found, which makes absolutely no sense because based on the amount of noise they heard the night before, they were expecting to see absolute destruction of their base. The common belief amongst soldiers at this point is that Observation Point Rock is extremely haunted by those who have lost their lives in the area, and when the men accidentally dug up the bones, it's likely that they could have released dark spirits of those who passed away. Unfortunately, since this incident in 2009, many of the men on the team have passed away at war, while others keep this haunting memory with them forever. Our last story for today's video is about the bird woman of Da Nang. Now, this story takes us back to the Vietnam War in August of 1969, when Earl Morrison and his comrades were on duty in the region of Da Nang. During this time, their only job was to keep a lookout for the enemy rotating in hourly blocks. All was quiet up until 1:30 in the morning when Earl and a few of his men noticed something very odd in the sky. Immediately, they noticed giant wings, and they thought that it could have been some sort of giant bird, maybe even a bat. And it didn't necessarily alarm them at the beginning. That is, until the creature got a lot closer to them, they were able to see something very odd. All of the men reported seeing the body of a woman attached to these wings, except it was not a human. It was human-like with unnaturally black skin. Its entire body was completely black. As it got closer and closer to the men, it began emitting this strange glow, with her wings being similar to those of a bat, but just as suddenly as she appeared, she flew off into the darkness, leaving them all unharmed. All of the men said that the thing, whatever it was, got about 6 to 10 feet in front of them, and all they could hear as it disappeared were the echo of the wings flapping in the darkness. Following day, Earl talked to a few locals about what he had just seen that previous night, and to his surprise, the locals had heard about this before. It turns out that many of the locals have seen this creature and have even given her the name the Bird Woman, who's known to feast on creatures and sometimes even people, ambushing them at night and carrying them off as their screams are heard in the distance. After that, Earl didn't speak of the incident, especially to anyone from back home, and it wasn't until 1972 when he felt comfortable enough to share his experience with the world. So what was it that the men could have seen? Was it an unknown cryptid? Was it a spirit? Or were they hallucinating and experiencing some strange phenomenon like what was thought to have been the case in the Vietnam rock ape situation? Let me know what you guys think. Alright, well that does it for today's video. Let me know if you guys enjoyed these stories. I'll be back hopefully next week with another 5 different stories on a completely different subject. If you guys have any suggestions, leave them in the comments below. But that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for joining me, guys, and don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, and check out my TikTok for more crime, creepy, and unbelievable content. I will see you guys in the next video.